U.S. House of Representatives has now sent impeachment articles to the Senate to allow the trial of Donald Trump to get underway. Before signing the two articles, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, "As we make that history, we will be making progress for the American people." So how will the trial in the Senate be conducted? What impact has Pelosi been able to have on the Senate impeachment process? And how will the whole affair influence the 2020 presidential election? To discuss these issues and more, in the first half of the program, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Huawei Liu, Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Emory University, and Professor John Gong from University of International Business and Economics. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Welcome to our dialogue here. Huawei, what do you make of the timing for the process of the impeachment?
Well, the timing, I don't think there is much significance to the timing, because after the House voted to impeach President Trump, the concern is that the majority leader of the Senate is going to have a very quick and fast hearing without calling any witnesses. So they're bargaining between the two chambers of the House, and I guess there might be some compromise between the two sides, and therefore the vote happened, and the impeachment measures will be sent to the Senate.
It's not a big surprise, is it, for particularly lawmakers in the House to introduce the act of impeachment for President Trump. It does surprise many who follow the process, because Nancy Pelosi has been holding on to the case for a while, saying we got to wait for a while. Mm-hmm. So the case has been held at the bay for quite a while. What do you think of the latest decision by Nancy Pelosi to go ahead?
I think her primary justification is that there'll be more evidence coming out. She doesn't want to rush to the case handed out to the Senate. But I think behind all this rhetoric, I think the objective is to prolong this process as much as possible, so that the impeachment thing is still in the the public discourse in the U.S. American politics of the public. So I think that's what she's trying to do, to keep this debate alive. And I think the Democrats know that they don't have the votes in the Senate. I think the primary objective is just to humiliate him in front of the American public and somehow damage his presidential campaign. The more time cutting into the getting to the campaign season, election season, the better, reportedly, for Democrats.
Then, John, what do you make of the defiance that characterizes the recent tweets by President Trump in relationship to the initiative by the House? He said, quote, "Here we go again, another con job by the do-nothing Democrats." What do you make of this remark?
Well, he is not just being defiant in his tweets. I mean, look at the ceremony last night, right? It was actually noontime in Washington, D.C. Supposed to be the signing of this trade agreements between China and the United States. But he spends like almost an hour, basically trying to rally the Republicans in this whole room and, trying to speak to the American people, essentially to fend off the impeachment. He keeps saying the words hoax, 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 So I think this is his style. He's always been like that. And he knows that he has the votes in the Senate, and there were enough Republicans going to be rallying around him. So he is very defiant, and he's just, waiting for that trial. It's not going to impeach him, in my opinion.
Huawei, do you think President Trump has made it diverting public attention from the issue of impeachment to the landmark successful signing phase 1 trade negotiations with the Chinese delegation?
Oh, I think obviously signing the first phase of the trade agreement certainly has registered with a lot of voters, and certainly has registered with the stock market. And to use every opportunity to defy and also to humiliate the Democratic leaders is always one of the more effective things in his toolbox. And he knows what is going to happen. And prolonging this process, I don't think it's going to be beneficial at all to the Democratic Party.
John, do you think we could still see healthy protection of the check and balance mechanism that was institutionalized by the founding fathers of the United States over 250 years ago, given the serious polarization of the spectrum across the aisle between Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I think this is actually a very much of a legal question here. It's also a very profound issue. You know, in my opinion, this impeachment thing is a political process from the very beginning. You know, it's a political trial, and it's going to be a political decision. So, you know, you ask the question whether there's enough check and balance. I think overall, the U.S. system, political system, still does a very good job of, you know, providing the check and balance. But I think in this case, you know, the evidence seems to be a little bit overwhelming to me. I mean, there are two articles in this impeachment. One is abuse of power, essentially, you know, using his presidential power to pressure a foreign government to, you know, to go after his political rival. That's, you know, I think there's enough evidence there, and I think, I mean, at least I'm convinced. And I think clearly it can be regarded as a abuse of power, in my opinion. But the problem is that, you know, you have those Republicans in the Senate that, you know, make a very political decision. They are voting for a Republican presidential, actually quite popular presidential president, and also the next presidential candidate. So, you know, it's not going to happen, in my opinion.
You know, President Clinton was almost impeached by the Congress over Lewinsky. However, Stormy Daniels is very different from Lewinsky. So why do you think both are sexual scandals, yet this time Stormy Daniels doesn't make much of a difference?
Well, I think President Clinton was impeached, well, it was actually the Republicans were trying to impeach him for lying to Congress, right? But in this case, President Trump is very different. You know, I think he did that. She did have a relationship with Stormy Daniels, and the person who actually did the dirty work for him is his lawyer. What his name is?
Okay, we don't want to talk much about the Techland story. However, it's just something ahead of a serious stuff. Right. The signing of a Phase 1 trade agreement between the United States and China. I don't want to be distracted by you know, this kind of stuff about the sex. However, we'll keep our eyes open on that. Please stay tuned. We'll be back after this short break. Welcome back. China and the United States have signed what's being called Phase 1 of a trade agreement in the ceremony at the White House in Washington, D.C. In the second half, we are also joined by Timothy Stratford, managing partner of Covington and Burling's Beijing office and former assistant U.S. trade representative. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. So, first of all, my question for Tim. Do you think Phase 1 agreement is a big deal?
I think it's a big deal in certain important respects. I think we're very glad to see it signed, and I think it has the prospect of putting a floor on the downward spiral that we saw in the U.S.-China economic relationship. So that's very good, and it shows that the two governments recognize that tariff battles are not productive for each side. At the same time, I think we would call it a fragile truce, because there are a lot of questions that remain to be resolved, but the fact that the two governments are taking this constructive step is an important condition for us to be able to resolve the rest of the problems.
Let's look at the issue of implementation or enforceability. Is it a difficult one? Is it a difficult issue for both sides, and particularly for the Americans to supervise the invisible part of the whole process on the Chinese side?
Well, I mean, there are several provisions in this document talking about, you know, the enforcement mechanism, the dialogue mechanism, reporting mechanism. But I think at the end of the day, the real enforcement is the tariff itself. Now, keep in mind that the tariffs are still very much in place here, right? 2/3 of Chinese exports to the United States are still subject to very high tariffs. And I think there got to be some agreement on both sides, maybe not public disclosed, that meeting certain milestones or, you know, reach an agreement maybe in this Phase 2, that there will be the rollback of these tariffs. And so I think this tariff thing is the ultimate enforcement mechanism. So I think the Chinese government would definitely do their best to implement this agreement. And I think that some of the things in this agreement are not necessarily sort of viewed as concessions from Chinese government side. I think at least the first two chapters, in my opinion, they're entirely the things in the nation's interest. So I think it will be in our own incentive to actually implement these things. Intellectual property rights protection, getting away these forced technology transfers. Those things are. It's good for the Chinese economy. I don't see why they cannot be
To start with, these are very important issues. Huawei, for people on both sides, as an observer who has followed the U.S.-China relationship for decades, now this time around, with the signing of the Phase 1 agreement, people on both sides say, hey, this amounts to surrendering. And many in China say there is currently a rebound in public sentiment relating this to the Plaza Accord that the Americans and the Japanese signed in the 1980s. That has contributed to up to 1 decade of stagnation, if not recession, for the Japanese economy. What do you think of such a clumsy comparison?
No, I think that, as you said, it's a very clumsy and counterproductive, and to a certain extent, very poisonous comparison. This is not China, as John mentioned in his. It's not surrendering. It took 2 years for the two sides to come together. Otherwise, as Tim said, the downward spiral of the bilateral relationship and how it hurts the economy is almost unthinkable and unimaginable. So for those who say China is making a concession, just shut up.
Is it a win-win situation? Do you think those critical voices should shut up?
Well, I mean, people can express their views. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I would give a lot of credit to the trade negotiators from both countries. They're dealing with very difficult issues, and now they've managed to put the negotiations in a positive light, and we can focus on implementing the agreement as it is now. I will agree that we still have a lot of issues to resolve, and so I think it's a fragile piece, and I think it's important for both governments to work very skillfully to recognize how fragile this is and to meet each other halfway. The rest of the issues that are not covered in Phase 1 are very tough. And it's difficult to see how we're going to reach agreement. And so if we don't reach agreement, how are we going to manage our differences? And going beyond that, each country has some doubts and suspicions about the other country's intentions on certain national security issues. We haven't resolved those, and those affect the economic relationship because what we do economically affects our national security capabilities. Those issues haven't been resolved, and so we really need to focus on having those discussions the same way we've been having economic discussions.
Here is a very interesting observation for both sides, that each side holds the other at bay to win time so that they could calculate wisely what would be done next. My next question for John is, China agreed to purchase an additional $200 billion worth of goods over the next 2 years. How will this affect China's import volume from other countries and other economies?
Well, I think there will be definitely an impact. Look at the beef and pork prices in Australia, for example. They're noticeably coming down. And I think in Europe, for example, people there must be very nervous about Chinese purchases of Airbus airplanes. In my opinion, this $200 billion over 2 years, so roughly it's about $100 billion a year, I would say maybe 30–40% of it is probably coming from diverting imports from other countries to the United States. So really, we're really talking about additional imports at the aggregate level, somewhere maybe between $50 to $60 billion a year. And this figure, compared to the total Chinese imports every year, it's actually a very moderate number. I mean, we are importing over $1 trillion of goods every year. So, $50 billion is not much of a big deal. And especially in consideration of, I think there's a very large amount coming from the energy sector in the United States. The United States is rapidly becoming the world's largest oil producing country, as well as the oil exporting country. So, having more exports of American energy products to China is something probably expected. So I think you asked this question, there's this public opinion about, this agreement, it sounds like China is surrendering. This is total nonsense. I think, many things in this document are in China's interest, as I've alluded to. The only thing that probably can be remotely related to that kind of a sentiment is the commitment of $200 billion of purchases over 2 years. But even that amount, as I just explained, the real impact, I think, is still very minimal. It's still quite moderate and can be digested very easily. I mean, overall, $50 billion is a very, very small percentage compared to China's imports as well as China's total economy.
Given the sizable market of the Chinese economy, Huawei, for example, aviation industry, look at the rapid development, the construction of local airports in the second and third tier cities throughout the whole country. I mean, it's a lot for Boeing, for example. Having said this, now do you think the size of the big market in China itself is convincing enough to let the negotiators on the American side understand perfectly that you shouldn't pursue a zero-sum game. You should give China a chance. You should give China time. And this time around, phase one aims to, create this kind of latitude and the margin for the flexibility, so that during the phase two, a lot more could be signed.
I think it's a very good question. The size of the market, obviously, from the Chinese perspective, is we have such a big market that no one can afford to lose this market. But if we look at how Trump and his advisors have conducted this trade negotiation, they seem to be, quote unquote, blind to the size of the market, to the power, China's purchasing power. As Tim mentioned, this is a very fragile piece. So the size of the market, to use that as a leverage, I think it's not enough. And China likes to use it. I would like to say, to use this as a coercive tool into this kind of equal negotiations probably is not going to generate a lot of victories down the road.
Tim, what do you think of the losses of American farmers so that they will run in the China-U.S. trade tensions, and how will this agreement affect the farmers' support for Donald Trump in the next election?
Well, there was some loss in agricultural sales to China during the last year and a half, and it seemed that a lot of the farmers were feeling rather patriotic, and if this is what we need to do to have a more balanced trade relation with China, we're willing to do our part. I think as it wore on, I think people, started to think about that. But I think now that President Trump is able to do this, probably the farmers will be pretty enthusiastic about it.
I saw a lot of ink talking about the 3 points: trade secrets, IPR violations, and coercive transfer of high technology from the United States and China to win market shares, and so on and so forth. What do you think should be the most difficult issues for both sides, particularly for the Chinese, to implement?
I don't think that's going to be very difficult. I think we're going to see some cases, to be honest with you. I think that people here in China, some business probably haven't realized the seriousness that is contained in this document. I think from now on, we're really going to see Chinese government maybe going after those violators. And there will be cases brought to court, and these things will happen. But it's actually a very good thing, I think. It brings our institutions, our legal environment, our business environment to the next level, and it makes our economy more competitive, actually. I always think about this very fundamental question. Ambassador Lighthizer has been trying to address these structural issues in a way to essentially, trying to make the U.S. economy, corporate America, more competitive. But I don't know if he realizes that if we're really going down that path, we're really implementing everything he wants us to do, it's probably going the exact opposite. It's making Chinese companies more competitive, it makes Chinese economy more competitive. So actually, I think it's probably a good thing that we're having this agreement, that we're trying to do these things. You asked me what would be the most difficult thing to do. I think probably coming up with $200 billion of imports is probably a little bit more difficult. The issue whether it really is America having enough things for sale to China, whether there's enough demand.
What do you think of the difficulty of fixing the issue of industrial espionage?
Oh, I think this is a matter relates to the determination of the government. You know, we all know that. I mean, both governments are, to some extent, going to be influenced by the intelligence communities on both sides, and they have their own agendas. They like to do their own things. So it's an issue of political will, whether we're going to stick to this document. And this actually applies to both sides. I think the industrial espionage and network intrusion is not just exclusive on the Chinese side. I think both sides are doing it. I'm pretty sure both sides are doing it. If there's any difference, there might be the difference of scale. But from now on, looks like we are going to. Now, keep in mind, this document talks about both sides too, right?
Yeah, yeah, of course. What about Huawei? Do you think this Phase 1 agreement would allow Huawei to enjoy sustainable supplies from the U.S. partners, and Huawei products will have access to the American market in return? What do you make of the prospects of Huawei?
Well, I think that's exactly one of the problems. The issues related to national security, or whether how do each country protect its IT systems and make sure that they're secure. That's something that's not addressed in this agreement. It's not something that USTR has the responsibility and authority to negotiate. And so one of the concerns I have is that our two governments still haven't worked out those issues yet. And each government has legitimate national security concerns about how to protect their cyber security and so on. And so there's nothing in the agreement that gives Huawei those kinds of protections. We haven't addressed those issues yet.
I actually feel the Huawei issue, so we still don't know how Huawei is posing a threat to American national security or to allies of the United States. U.S. said we have evidence, but we don't want to tell you, because if we tell you the evidence, you'll know how we collect the evidence.
Well, but there are some fundamental issues, though, because, and even if you assume that Huawei is the most responsible country on the planet, and I'm not here to criticize Huawei. Company, yes. Right. Even if you assume that, if a foreign company basically controls your 5G network, your financial sector, your transport sector, your social media, all of these things are going to be built on this IT system.
Well, come on, let's look at what the UK government is going to do.
Customer base of Huawei.
Boris Johnson said it's time for the British government to consider carefully whether Huawei would be allowed to be involved in a non-core part of the deployment.
I think we have to be realistic. Huawei's business customer base in the United States are mostly rural telecoms, right? I don't think there's going to be making inroads into the major, carriers. If they're making some sales to Verizon or AT&T, and mostly selling cell phones, not so much into the carrier infrastructure equipment. Aside from this,
that's before 5G. So what Tim is talking about is
the
future 5G network. Right.
I wasn't arguing that that the United States should not purchase any Huawei equipment. What I was saying is that the United States has legitimate concerns about giving a foreign company that much potential power, and China will have the same concerns. So what I'm saying is there are concerns that need to be addressed, and maybe Boris Johnson will come up with a way that's reasonable. But I'm saying those are complicated and very important discussions that need to take place, and they haven't taken place yet.
If not Huawei, what would be the alternatives? That's the question by Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the UK. Now, let's look at the possibility President Trump is coming to Beijing for Phase 2 agreement. How likely will he be coming? And is that just part of the PR campaign?
No, I don't think it's a PR campaign. He came in November 2017, as a state visit, and there was a huge ceremony, and he really liked China. He was entertained in the Forbidden City.
Maybe Ivanka likes China more than his father.
Probably. And I think given the current political environment in the U.S., it's actually much easier for President Trump to come over here than vice versa. By protocol, I think it should be President Xi going to the U.S. for a state visit. But there might be a lot of other oppositions, and Trump can go anytime he wants to go, and he understands.
I think-
there will be a huge ceremony waiting for him.
I think President Trump is probably more welcome in China than in the United States. When he said that he's going to come to China, there got to be some discussion behind the scene. And I think his visit is going to happen. He would not have put out this tweet and said this yesterday at a ceremony without having some kind of discussion with the Chinese government. I think it's going to happen. And it's also, let me finish, it's also very important that China wants to start the second phase negotiation as soon as possible because the tariffs are still there, right? And also this is the position from the American Chamber of Commerce here in China, that they want to have the second phase as soon as possible and have these tariffs removed. So I think he's going to come to China.
In your assessment and observation, Tim, how long will it take to conclude the second phase? Very quickly.
Well, we've heard different views from President Trump, and he said that maybe not until after the next election. I think it will be very difficult because I think the issues are very, very challenging for the two governments to reach agreement on. So I think it will be quite some time, and I think each government's going to have a change of view about how to approach this before we're going to be able to achieve success.
Thank you so much. That's the end of this discussion and brainstorming about the results and deliverables of phase one, but we are looking already into phase two. That's going to be a long, arduous journey. I can assure you of that. Until then, goodbye.